I've been a police officer for over 20 years, and in that time, I've seen things that would make most people's skin crawl. The job isn't just about catching criminals and writing tickets. Sometimes it's about facing the unknown, the inexplicable, and the downright terrifying. These are the stories that haunt me, the ones I can't forget no matter how hard I try. They say the truth is stranger than fiction, and after hearing what I'm about to tell you, I think you'll agree. Story 1: The Haunting of Cedarwood Police Station. Cedarwood Police Station was an old building, one of the oldest in the city. It had a history, and not all of it was good. There were stories about the place, whispers among the officers about strange occurrences and ghostly sightings. I never paid much attention to them until I experienced it myself. It was a quiet night, and I was working the late shift. The station was nearly empty, just a few officers and the dispatcher. I was sitting at my desk, catching up on paperwork, when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination, but then it happened again. This time, the whisper was clearer, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Help me," it said. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around the room. Still, there was no one there. I walked down the hallway, checking each room, but everything was as it should be. I was about to head back to my desk when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It stared at me for a moment before disappearing into one of the rooms. I ran after it, my flashlight in hand, but when I reached the room, it was empty. The only thing out of place was a single piece of paper on the floor. I picked it up and read the words scrawled across it: "Help me." Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Other officers reported seeing the figure, and strange things started happening around the station. Lights flickered, doors slammed shut on their own, and the whispers grew louder. We tried to ignore it, to go about our work as usual, but it was impossible. The station was haunted, and there was nothing we could do about it. One night, I decided to stay late and see if I could get to the bottom of it. I set up a camera in the hallway where the figure had been seen and waited. Hours passed and nothing happened. I was about to give up when I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "Help me." I looked at the camera feed and saw the figure standing in the hallway, staring directly at the camera. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the hallway, but when I got there, it was gone. The only thing left was the piece of paper with the same message: "Help me." I never found out who or what was haunting Cedarwood Police Station, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it was desperate for help, and it wasn't going to stop until it got it. Story 2: The Midnight Shift. The midnight shift is usually quiet, but that night was different. I was patrolling a deserted stretch of road on the outskirts of town when I saw him. A man standing by the side of the road, waving frantically. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "What's the problem, sir?" I asked. He looked terrified, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something out there," he said, pointing towards the woods. Something, not human. I got out of the car and shone my flashlight into the darkness. "What did you see?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know. It was tall, with glowing eyes. It chased me all the way here." I radioed for backup and told the man to stay in the car. As I walked towards the woods, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed amplified. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. I reached the edge of the woods and stopped. There was something out there, I could feel it. I took a deep breath and stepped into the trees. The darkness closed in around me, and I had to rely on my flashlight to see where I was going. I walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, watching me. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to burn into my soul. I raised my flashlight, but the figure disappeared before the light could reach it. I heard a rustling behind me and spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. I took a step forward, and the ground gave way beneath me. I fell into a pit, landing hard on the dirt floor. I lay there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the pit, looking down at me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched me, its glowing eyes filled with malice. I scrambled to my feet and tried to climb out of the pit, but the walls were too steep. I was trapped. The figure stepped closer, and I could see its face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, clammy grip on my arm. I screamed and kicked, trying to break free, but the figure was too strong. It pulled me closer, its breath cold on my face. I could feel its fingers digging into my skin, and I knew I was going to die. Then suddenly it let go. I fell back into the pit, gasping for air. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I heard voices calling my name and saw the beams of flashlights cutting through the darkness. My backup had arrived. They pulled me out of the pit and took me back to the station. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said I must have imagined it, that it was just a trick of the light. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there waiting. Story 3. Dispatch 911. Working as a 911 dispatcher, you hear a lot of strange things, but this call was different. It came in late one night, just as I was about to end my shift. The voice on the other end was faint and trembling. "Please help me," the caller whispered. "What's your emergency?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's someone in my house," the caller said. "I can hear them upstairs." I quickly traced the call to an address on the outskirts of town. "Stay on the line," I said. "Help is on the way." I dispatched a unit to the address and stayed on the line with the caller. "Can you tell me where you are in the house?" I asked. "I'm in the basement," the caller replied. "I locked the door, but I don't know how long it will hold." I could hear the fear in their voice, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Stay quiet and stay on the line," I said. "The officers will be there soon." Minutes passed, and I could hear the sound of footsteps above the caller. They were getting closer. "They're coming," the caller whispered. "Please hurry." I heard the sound of a door creaking open, and then the line went dead. My heart sank. I radioed the officers and told them to hurry. When they arrived at the house, they found the front door wide open. They searched the house from top to bottom, but found no sign of the caller or the intruder. The house had been abandoned for years. Story 4. The Hollow Voice. It was a quiet night when the call came in. A woman reported hearing a strange voice coming from the woods behind her house. She said it sounded like someone was calling for help, but when she went to investigate, there was no one there. I was dispatched to the scene and met the woman at her front door. She looked pale and shaken. "It's been happening for the past few nights," she said. "I hear the voice around midnight, but when I go outside, there's no one there." I assured her that I would check it out and headed into the woods. The night was dark and still, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. I walked for a while, but there was no sign of anyone. Then I heard it, a faint voice calling out from the darkness. "Help me," it said. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please." I reached a clearing and saw a figure standing in the middle, their back to me. "Hello," I called out. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, and the voice called out again. "Help me." I reached out to touch the figure's shoulder, but my hand passed right through it. The figure dissolved into mist, and the voice faded away. I stood there stunned, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I never found out who or what was calling for help in those woods, but I know one thing for sure. Some voices are better left unanswered. Story 5. The Whispering Woods. The call came in just before dawn. A hiker had gone missing in the woods, and a search party was being organized. I joined the team and headed out to the last known location of the missing person. The woods were dense and dark, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. We spread out, calling the hiker's name as we walked. Hours passed, and there was no sign of them. Then, as the sun began to set, we heard it, a faint whispering coming from deeper in the woods. It was barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. We reached a clearing and saw a figure standing in the middle, their back to us. "Hello," I called out. "Are you the hiker?" The figure didn't respond. We approached cautiously, and as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was standing perfectly still, too still. I reached out to touch their shoulder, and they collapsed to the ground. It was the missing hiker, but they were dead. Their eyes were wide open, and their face was twisted in a look of sheer terror. We searched the area, but found no sign of what had scared them so badly. As we carried the body back to the trailhead, the whispering started again. It followed us all the way out of the woods, growing fainter with each step. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left unexplored. Story 6. The Phantom Patrol Car. It was a foggy night when the call came in about a suspicious vehicle parked on a deserted road. I was dispatched to check it out. As I approached the location, I saw the car, a black patrol car identical to ours, but with no markings or license plates. I parked behind it and got out, shining my flashlight into the car. It was empty. I radioed in to report the find, but my radio crackled with static. Suddenly, the patrol car's engine roared to life, and it sped off into the fog. I jumped back into my car and gave chase. The fog was thick, and I could barely see the taillights of the phantom car ahead of me. It led me on a wild chase through winding roads and deserted streets, always just out of reach. Finally, the car turned down a dead-end street and disappeared. I stopped and got out, but there was no sign of it. The street was empty and the fog was lifting. I radioed in again, and this time the signal was clear. When I returned to the station, I told my colleagues what had happened. They looked at me with a mix of disbelief and concern. "That road has been closed for years," one of them said. "There shouldn't have been any cars there." I never saw the phantom patrol car again, but I still think about it every time I drive down that road. Story 7. The Silent Witness. I was called to the scene of a brutal murder in an old, abandoned house. The victim was a young woman, and the scene was gruesome. As I walked through the house, I felt a strange presence, like someone was watching me. I found a small room at the back of the house, and inside was an old, dusty mirror. As I looked into it, I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. It was the reflection of a woman, her face twisted in fear. She was mouthing something, but no sound came out. I turned around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly left the room. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started seeing the woman's reflection in other mirrors, always mouthing the same silent words. I tried to ignore it, but it became more frequent, more insistent. One night, I decided to go back to the house and see if I could find any clues. As I walked through the dark, empty rooms, I heard a faint whisper. It was the woman's voice, and she was saying, "Help me." I followed the voice to the small room with the mirror. This time, the reflection was clear, and the woman was pointing to a spot on the floor. I knelt down and pried up a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a diary filled with the woman's desperate pleas for help. She had been held captive in the house and had written about her tormentor in detail. I took the diary to the station, and it led to the arrest of a suspect who had been under our radar for years. The woman's spirit never appeared to me again, but I like to think that she finally found peace. Story 8. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a rainy night, and I was driving down a lonely stretch of highway when I saw her. A young woman standing by the side of the road, soaked to the bone. I pulled over and offered her a ride. She climbed into the back seat, shivering and thanking me profusely. She said her name was Emily, and that she had been walking for hours after her car broke down. I offered to take her to the nearest town, and she gratefully accepted. As we drove, we talked about everything and nothing. She seemed nice enough, but there was something off about her. Her clothes were old-fashioned, and she kept glancing nervously out the window. When we reached the town, I turned to ask her where she wanted to be dropped off, but she was gone. The back seat was empty, and there was no sign of her. I pulled over and got out, looking around, but there was no one there. I went to the local diner and asked if anyone had seen a young woman matching Emily's description. The waitress looked at me with a sad smile. "You must have picked up the vanishing hitchhiker," she said. "Emily died in a car accident on that highway years ago. People say she still tries to get home." I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't explain what had happened. I drove back to the spot where I had picked her up, but there was no sign of her. The rain had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. Story 9. The Cursed Badge. I was a rookie cop when I found it, an old police badge buried in the dirt behind the station. It was tarnished and worn, but I cleaned it up and decided to keep it as a good luck charm. At first, everything seemed fine. I wore the badge on my belt, and my luck seemed to improve. I made a few good arrests, and my superiors took notice. But then strange things started happening. I began having nightmares about a man in a police uniform, his face twisted in rage. He would chase me through dark alleys and abandoned buildings, always just out of reach. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. During my shifts, I started seeing the man in the shadows. He would appear for a moment and then disappear, always watching me with those angry eyes. I tried to ignore it, but it became more frequent, more real. One night, I was patrolling a quiet neighborhood when I saw him standing in the middle of the street. I stopped the car and got out, but he was gone. I looked down and saw the badge lying on the ground, glowing faintly in moonlight. I picked it up and felt a surge of anger and fear. I knew then that the badge was cursed and that it had belonged to the man in my nightmares. I threw it into the river and watched it sink into the dark water. The nightmare stopped and I never saw the man again, but I still think about that badge and wonder what happened to its original owner. Story 10. The Haunted Evidence Room. The evidence room at our station was a place no one liked to go. It was dark and cramped, filled with the remnants of countless crimes. But it was my job to catalog and organize everything, so I spent a lot of time there. One night, I was working late, sorting through old case files, when I heard a noise. It was a faint whisper, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. I went back to work, but the whispering continued. It grew louder, more insistent, until I could make out the words. "Help me," it said. "Please, help me." I followed the sound to a dusty old box in the corner of the room. Inside was a collection of personal items, photos, letters, and a small, worn diary. The diary belonged to a young woman who had been murdered years ago. Her case had never been solved. As I read through the diary, I felt a chill run down my spine. The woman had written about her fears, her suspicions that someone was watching her. She had even named a suspect, someone who had never been investigated. I took the diary to my superiors, and they reopened the case. The suspect was brought in for questioning, and eventually, he confessed to the crime. The woman's spirit never appeared to me again, but I like to think that she finally found justice. Story 11. The Shadow in the Cell. It was a quiet night at the station, and I was assigned to monitor the holding cells. Most of the cells were empty, except for one. A man had been brought in earlier that evening for public intoxication. He was asleep on the cot, snoring loudly. As the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The lights in the hallway flickered, and I heard strange noises coming from the cell block. I walked down the hall to check on the prisoner, but when I looked into his cell, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark shadow was standing over the man, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. The man was still asleep, oblivious to the presence looming over him. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was just tired and seeing things. But then the man started to scream. He thrashed on the cot, his eyes wide with terror. I rushed into the cell and tried to calm him down, but he kept screaming about a shadow that was trying to take him. I called for backup, and we moved the man to another cell. He was still hysterical, but eventually he calmed down enough to tell us what had happened. He said that the shadow had been following him for days, whispering terrible things in his ear. He had tried to outrun it, but it had finally caught up to him. We searched the cell block, but there was no sign of the shadow. The man was released the next morning, and I never saw him again. But I still think about that night and wonder what kind of darkness had found its way into our station. Story 12. The ghost of Highway 13. Highway 13 had a reputation for being haunted. There were countless stories about strange sightings and unexplained accidents, but I never believed them until I experienced it myself. It was a foggy night, and I was patrolling the highway when I saw her, a woman in a white dress, standing by the side of the road. I pulled over and got out of the car, but when I approached her, she vanished into thin air. I got back into my car, shaken but determined to find out what was going on. I drove up and down the highway, but there was no sign of the woman. Just as I was about to give up, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car passed right through her, and I felt a cold chill run through my body. I stopped the car and got out, but the woman was gone. I radioed in to report the incident, but my colleagues just laughed and told me I had seen the ghost of Highway 13. They said she was the spirit of a woman who had died in a car accident years ago, and that she appeared to warn drivers of the dangers of the highway. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I couldn't explain what had happened. I still patrol Highway 13, but I always keep an eye out for the woman in the white dress. And every time I see her, I remember the cold chill and the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows.